What is crack-a-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Pavale coming at you with a podcast about one of the most fascinating teams in the NBA right now, the Minnesota Timberwolves, and I am super excited to be joined by, I get to now say, a returning guest, Kyle Tighe from the Dane Moore NBA podcast, as well as the Flagrant Howls podcast over at Score North. They are both in my regular rotation for any of our listeners who care, so go check them out. The links to that will be in the podcast and YouTube description, as always. Follow Kyle on Twitter at Kyle Tighe. That's at Theige as the last name, and Kyle spelled exactly as it sounds. Kyle, one, welcome back. And two, how the heck are you doing?
One, thank you as always. I told you before we hit record that I love doing this pod. And two, more than anything, I appreciate you letting me kick it down another day. I know we were going to try to go yesterday. Vibes, Timberwolves fan base yesterday, not great. 24 hours later, after what I think was a historic comeback, I think I saw that they were the first team in like 5,500 games to be down 22 or more points and then win by 20. So at halftime last night, vibes were bad. A lot of fans wanted Kyle Anderson kind of excommunicated, and 24 to 28 minutes later, they're up by 20, and they got a really, really probably the most important win of the season against the Clippers team that they were kind of fighting for maybe that 3 spot in the West, depending on how OKC and Denver do. But it was a really big game, not only for tiebreakers, not only for standings, but also just another win that they can show, hey, until Karl comes back from that injury, we can kind of stem the tide. So really cool game. Always fun for a small market team to do it on TNT, kind of get that national exposure. But I am hungover today because I celebrated that win. So let's get into it.
Yeah, that was just this. I had mentioned this to you before we started, the progression of social media sentiment where I wasn't tweeting during the game, but I'd seen the stuff that was out there, and not just about Kyle Anderson, but the Wolves. And I'd had someone message me that said they thought the Wolves were more likely to finish 5th or 6th instead of like in the top 3. And like that win just flips everything on its head. And now I have specific questions about it because it feels like maybe they unlocked some certain things they can move forward with. But we did get the news before the game that Karl-Anthony Towns undergoes surgery to repair that meniscus, I believe, and they're going to reevaluate him in 4 weeks. And it's always funny to see, from my perspective, to see the reaction where it's like, oh, we are so going to have him back before the playoffs, where I look at it and say, okay, well, it says reevaluation. It doesn't say like he's going to be back in 5-on-5 at that point. What do you have any sense, or even just personally, as to like what the hope should be, or a realistic timeline for when he comes back? Because the repair recoveries, if I'm not mistaken, they're normally supposed to last, like the return to play is like, it's supposed to take longer than if you have it removed. And the fact that it seems like he had it repaired, unless I'm mistaken there too, like even a 6-week timetable feels a little ambitious.
Yeah, it's the best spot to start with this team because it's the biggest news. It's been, I think, 1 full week since they officially lost him. It was announced last Thursday that he had torn it right before that Indiana Pacers game, which ended up being maybe the most fun game of the season, with Anthony Edwards just hitting his back on the backboard. But
I can't stop looking at that picture, by the way, of like the freeze frame of him just like hitting the rim.
I need every angle of that. Like, if there's more that like Zapruder film, I just kind of want to study it because it was one of the most impressive athletic moments I've just seen. It doesn't matter if I'm a Wolves fan or not. But back to Karl. Yeah, it's weird because the team with injuries. I mean, even just a year ago when Karl was dealing with what ended up being a really serious calf injury, it was like January, and like, I think he's supposed to be back, and he wasn't back in February, and we just didn't know. So with this one, especially with the meniscus tear, like you said, and doing the surgery, he had it performed out in LA yesterday, as most surgeries do in sports. It went successful. But 4 weeks reevaluation, yeah, I get it from a fan's point, right? Like, you want your players to be back. You play, maybe play video games, and you're like, okay, this injury, he'll be back in 4 weeks or whatever. Every body, as you start to, you cover the whole league, right, Dan? Like, these players, everybody's different. So how he'll recover, how he'll rehab. I know this morning he tweeted out like a Dragon Ball Z in the lab rehabbing photo. So I know he's already kind of on the up and up. But yeah, they're going to look at him in 4 weeks and kind of figure it out. But in that 4 weeks, like, he's not getting any game, like, not even minutes, right? He's obviously not going to play. But game shape and cardio shape are just completely different. So when they reevaluate him in 4 weeks, that's, I think, game 80 on the schedule. So they'll still have a couple of regular season games left that they can kind of work his way in, whether he's playing or just ramping up his own cardio. But because, again, last night's win was so big, they are distancing themselves like firmly from being a play-in team. So they're going to have that week between the end of the regular season on Sunday to when the playoffs start the following Saturday or Sunday. They'll probably start at home as a top 4 seed, knock on wood. So there is about 6.5 weeks here to kind of wiggle with to get Karl back. Without him, I just don't. It'll be matchup specific. Obviously, do they play the Suns, Dallas, whatever? Can they get through a game or two? But the one that really matters to me is when you hear Chris Finch talk, because Chris Finch is like the most. I mean, I'm a pro Chris Finch guy. He might be the best head coach in Timberwolves history, him or the late great Flip Saunders. But he's not going to lie to you most of the time, and he's been pretty like kind of upbeat about getting Karl back. So the vibes seem to say that he will be back for the playoffs, but for now, I think all this team can do is kind of just go next man up, whether that be Naz Reid, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. You kind of have that card in your back pocket. You hope he recovers. You hope he can come back, because without him, they don't really have a firm chance of advancing too far in the West. But if you've seen what they've done since Karl went down, the Indiana game, the Cleveland game, the Lakers game was a little different, but then against the Clippers last night, like they are capable with the guys they have of probably beating almost anyone, especially like a 5 through 8 seeds. So we'll hope Karl comes back. We'll kind of watch and monitor his rehab. But for now, it's Anthony Edwards' team for the most part, and they'll go as far as that young 22-year-old kid can take them.
Wow, Anthony Edwards only 22. I don't wish injury. So when I say it, I don't mean it'd be okay if it happened to someone else. But for Towns specifically, all the iterations that he's just lived through with the Timberwolves, all the shit he's gone through on and off the court, you just really want him to be one. You want the best players to be on the court when you get to the playoffs anyway, especially when we're talking about the best teams. But just like this is like the culmination of everything of like his career has been building up to, where they have expectations where like they should like in theory should be favored during their first round playoff series, wherever they're going into. So I really just like to see him back on the court and hopefully he gets healthy and then looking like Karl-Anthony Towns. So just a bummer that like they're this good and he's so integral to what they're doing while they're being this good. And then this happens. And it's just like infuriating. And it was his injury kind of came at the point too, where we're dealing with all this other stuff. Like there was Trae Young and there's since been Sadiq Bey and now Prince Sengun and Benedict Mathurin. Can we turn NBA injury mode off for just a few months at this point? I mean, my God.
Really, because the Wolves had pretty easy schedule and they took advantage of it, right? Have been in first place in the West for like, I don't know, 90% of the season. They've been the best defense by net rating. But when they came back after All-Star break, they did have 7 straight at home, but then it just kind of got super dicey with, I don't think any team had more back-to-backs than them. Their schedule was, if you're from Minnesota right now, like, the Spurs have their rodeo road trip where they have to like leave for 2 or 3 weeks. Minnesota has like their state basketball road trip where boys and girls state basketball in the state of Minnesota is played at Target Center. So the Wolves had to like leave for 10 to 12 days. And they have so many back-to-backs, and you're starting to see these injuries pile up. I mean, Naz Reid had multiple ankles. Monty Morris had a hamstring. Rudy Gobert had a hamstring. Kyle Anderson, and then the big one being Karl. So they're just kind of fighting what I think a lot of other teams have fought throughout their schedule, is just a lot of games in a condensed amount of time. But to your point about all the injuries in general, it's just another one of those things where it's like, I would imagine before you and I die, Dan, and hopefully we have long lives, that this thing is cut from 82 games to like 72 or maybe, 65 and just stretched out, because there's just, even as a fan, I find myself being like, we joked before we hit record, I'm taking a vacation next week. I just don't want to think about the Wolves for a week. I just need a break from the NBA, because if your team is good, you're probably going to play until May or June, and 10 months of basketball is way too much basketball for me, even as a diehard fan.
No, I totally get that. So with Towns, and I want to make clear, I don't think this is the sentiment like of people who follow and cover the Wolves, but kind of outside that little bubble, do you think there's still maybe a little bit of a disconnect of how valuable he actually is to what they do, specifically looking at offense? Is not just someone, yes, we know what he could do as a floor spacer and open things up, but as someone who can like actually attack through multiple layers of defense in a way that Mike Conley or Jaden McDaniels or Naz Reid certainly even can't. Do you think that there still might be a fundamental lack of appreciation for what Karl-Anthony Towns does? Even just looking at now, would Rudy Gobert have been my all-star pick from the Wolves if I would have gotten one? He would have. But like even just the reaction to Karl-Anthony Towns making the all-star game, do you think that's still sort of a thing?
100%. And it's probably because of how intertwined we are, or the league is, to like NBA Twitter, right? He's one of the easier, he's an odd guy. He's kind of socially different. He's very nice. I don't think teammates ever have anything that's bad to say about him, but he just gets kind of nitpicked for, whatever people perceive the voice changes or the funny things he says on podcasts or some of the silly things he said about, what they did in the play-in being as important or as, valuable as what the Nuggets did. He's just kind of a goofy guy, but goofy gets handled really poorly, I think, in the NBA compared to other leagues. So he just, he had a huge night against the Hornets, right, where he dropped like 60, and they lose that game. And that's just, again, like, classic Timberwolves, classic Karl-Anthony Towns. So, the thing you said about what poor timing for his injury, that injury that does sideline him now for the rest of the regular season probably came a week after he had to bury another one of his friends, like his high school friends that, he has dealt with a lot of loss in his life, most notably his mom and a lot of other people due to COVID. So he's just gone through a lot. And I think that's, I don't want to call it stigma because a lot of us are really pro Karl, but around the league, people just kind of use him as a punching bag. And those types of athletes don't really get the respect until they start winning. And for Karl, like, he's winning now. And I think that's why he made the All-Star team. I've said that I think this is Karl's best season as a pro. Statistically, it's not his biggest, but the fit that he's had with Rudy Gobert, and then, he was known around the league as like just a bad defender. He's been serviceable, if not maybe good this year. All the stuff before he went out, like all the net rating stuff, all the defense, he's really good even when Rudy's off the floor. So he is having a great year. I thought he deserved to be an All-Star. I'm with you. Rudy Gobert also probably deserved to be an All-Star, but Minnesota's never going to get 3 guys, even though the Hawks that one year got 5. So
that might have been a comment on the state of the East that year.
That's true. That's true. I think his perception is just going to constantly be what it is until he wins. And that's how a lot of players are treated. And this team has the best chance to win a playoff series for the first time. It's been 20 years, Dan, since they advanced past the first round when Kevin Garnett was here. So yeah, that kind of tells you how all of us, why we consume a lot of alcohol. But this is the first chance that this team really has to advance, and they're going to need Karl to come back because with him, they can lean into. They have an identity, and I've covered this team for 8 years. They've never really had an identity before. They're big, they're physical, they're long, and even against the Clippers last night without Karl, they just showed that. Like, you put Jaden McDaniels on an island against Paul George, and he can just shut him down. Ant had like the most viral moment last night when Reggie Miller was like kind of slobbing all over him about being a dog, when he just didn't let Paul George get into the lane, stole the ball, went down and had a layup. So they need Karl back. I think Karl's perception would benefit from a good playoff series because even when he is in the playoffs, hasn't been great. But if they could win a first-round series, I think a lot of guys, their Q scores around the league would go up.
When you're looking at now how they've approached life without Towns, they've decided with the starting 5. I don't necessarily care who starts, but I do think it like kind of clues you into like, Chris Finch wants to really stabilize the defense still in those minutes out of the gate by putting in Kyle Anderson, like in Karl-Anthony Towns' spot. We did see some changes kind of though in the second half against the Clippers. So could he go in a different direction? But what have you thought though about the overarching decision to say, well, we're going to play Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert together without Naz Reid on the court from the jump? And do you now expect that to change after what happened with the Clippers? And just to reiterate for our listeners, like the Timberwolves are not like this super high volume 3-pointing team to begin with. And when you remove Karl-Anthony Towns from those core other 4 starters, like their 3-point attempt rate is basically nothing. It's like, I don't know what I had it marked down after it is of the Clippers game, but like without Towns, only they're shooting 31.3% on twos, like with that starting lineup, and under 30% of their shots are coming from 3. That's a very low number in today's NBA. And so what have you made of that initial decision? And do you like kind of expect this, maybe not even the starting 5, but the way that he gets to certain lineups in games will change, change moving forward?
I think so. I've kind of stopped looking at various stats, just probably in denial still about the Karl stuff over the last week. But prior to Karl's injury, I think the Wolves were second in the league in 3-point percentage, but they were like 25th in the league in 3 points attempted. So like you can just kind of look at that and be like, why don't you just take more? And Karl was, him or Ant, the highest volume guys on the team with like out any competition. A lot of times, like I said, Rudy's not taking threes. Kyle Anderson has just stopped taking threes. They don't have a lot of other volume guys. Jaden McDaniels will get 3 attempts a game. Mike Conley will get 4 to 5. We can talk about that. That is a topic that hurts my heart. But the Kyle Anderson thing, up until, I would say for the first 35 years of my life, I was with you, Dan, like up until March 12th. We're recording this on March 13th. Up until March 12th, I was pretty much like, I don't care who starts. It matters who finishes. I think Kyle Anderson has, and I like Kyle, has forced me to change that perspective because I don't think Kyle Anderson can start anymore because I don't know how many other contending teams in the league or, I don't know, top 4 or 5 teams in the league start two non-shooters, like you just know Rudy's never going to shoot threes. That's just like he is a traditional rim protecting, rebounding center. So it's just so bad when he's out there. And then the Jaden McDaniels thing is a part of this too. He was 0 for 8 last night, had tremendous defense again, but offensively hasn't been consistent and maybe has regressed a step. I think a lot of it's just in his head. I don't really worry about him. He did sign a big contract extension in October, so next year instead of $3 million, he's gonna be making like 20. So he has to figure out that part of his game. But I would imagine, and you kind of saw it last night in the second half. Again, for anyone who doesn't follow this team a lot, Anthony Edwards is awesome and is cool and is funny and is great at basketball, but he doesn't show up on time all the time. Like last night again in the second half, like he wasn't there. And a couple games ago, he like didn't make it to the scorer's table in time to start. But last night it was really interesting because they started a 5-man lineup in the first half of Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Kyle Anderson at the 4, and then Rudy Gobert. The second half, they started Nikhil in place of Ant because he was, I guess, probably in the bathroom, and then Kyle as well. But when Ant came in 12 seconds later, Dan, he put him in for Kyle.
Yep.
So that might be the first kind of sign that maybe Chris Finch, they have a couple of days off. The team's hanging out in LA, which everyone should do. But they play on Utah in Saturday. And I would imagine that maybe he starts like a Mike Conley, Nikhil, Alexander Walker, Ant, Jaden, and Rudy, just to have more spacing out there. Naz Reid is like the guy, and he's kind of starting to get the fame that he deserves as being an undrafted kid out of LSU who is making a lot of money now and is one of the most exciting, I guess, 6-man of the year and might be the starter down the road. Who knows, next to Rudy Gobert. But I like Naz off the bench because I think he just gives you that punch and he allows Chris Finch to kind of adjust his rotations. I mean, they only have 2 centers now, which is funny because they had 3 and everyone thought that was too many, and now all of a sudden they're down Karl, and it's like they don't have enough. But I would hope. That was a long-winded way because it's the most hot-button topic right now in the fan base of a lot of people, I think, if they had the choice, would like to punch Kyle like Rudy did last year because it's just been so stagnant. But he does a lot of things still, man. He plays great defense. You kind of look up and you're like, Kyle was bad tonight. And then he's like, oh, he led the team in plus-minus, which I know wasn't a be-all, end-all. But Finch just trusts him. He's like the Swiss Army knife, the trusting,
he was a point guard against the Clippers at like stretches. So
yeah, I mean, I think he had like 10, 7, and 6 last night. But I still think Kyle Anderson's good. I just think in different lineups and maybe with less Rudy because I put it this way, in 2024, you just don't play lineups that have only 3 shooters. And sometimes for the Wolves, it's like 2.5 with Jaden or like a Jordan McLaughlin who's been hit or miss. So I think they just need to find ways to space out Kyle and Rudy a little more. I mean, Kyle Anderson can play 5, like in small ball lineups. So that would be the hope moving forward. We're going to get a big kind of sample size or view into what Chris Finch thinks on Saturday night against the Jazz because they just need to surround Ant. This whole thing now revolves around that kid. They need to surround him with as much spacing as possible and guys that can get out in transition and defend a little more because as you saw last night in the second half, when they have shooters and guys that can defend out there, I don't know, man, even without Karl, I don't know how many teams outside of Boston and Denver can beat them.
And everything you just said kind of also underscores the importance of Karl-Anthony Towns, to where you want Naz Reid to come off the bench.
Yeah.
You want to have enough spacing around Anderson. Like that's the luxury of having Karl-Anthony Towns, his ability to play the forward, where you don't run in to, yes, the Wolves still have spacing conundrums in the half court a lot of times, but they're not as just disastrous or exacerbated when it's like Kyle Anderson, Rudy Gobert. Mm-hmm. So not having Towns, like you said, it pulls that spacing big and just creates this whole other different issue, especially with, the Monte Morris now hit that hamstring injury. We'll see if that lingers. It feels like it might be easier to like stagger the way they want, maybe when he comes back, because that's someone you could trust as a floor spacer too. Do you have any sense, or how would you go about like trying to like ensure that you're staggering Anderson and Gobert? Like how complicated is it to stagger those two as much as possible without Karl-Anthony Towns there right now?
It's complicated. It's funny because Kyle Anderson won over the hearts of many last year. I deemed him the best free agent signing in Wolves franchise history.
Right, again,
if you don't follow this team closely, you're probably thinking, well, that's hyperbolic. No, actually the bar for this team on any sort of best ever is pretty low. Go look at who they've signed. There's not a lot of good free agent signings in the history of this team. But he was great last year because, as I always joked, he spoke French. Like, he knew how to unlock Rudy Gobert when no one else on the team really did. And he was serviceable from 3. I think he had his best season of his career just shooting from three. He doesn't even take them anymore. Like, that's the concern. And he had a late injury in the season where he got hit in the eye by Anthony Edwards, like on an elbow on a rebound attempt. Had to get some pretty serious surgery in the offseason. And I don't know. No one really talks about it. No one really dives into it. But I don't know if that's part of this whole mystery. But he just doesn't shoot threes anymore. And it's become kind of an issue. So they needed Kyle last year. But now everyone else on the team is at least somewhat fluent in French. Like Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert are one of the best, I guess, pick and roll kind of threats in the league. Ant's been better about finding him. Jaden, even when they bring in guys like you said, like Amani Morris, who is, I think will be back this weekend. He was tweeting or Instagramming that he was back with a little Wolves emoji. So they need him because he's going to spell Mike Conley in those minutes. You don't want Mike Conley at 36 playing 30 minutes a game in late March. But yeah, I think you can play Kyle more with Naz, like a 4-5, or maybe have Kyle be a backup point guard for Mike while Monty Morris is out. It's just the combination of that being your front court, two guys at a 4-5. I know positions are a little more fluid in 2024, but you can't have two guys on the court, simply put, that can't shoot the ball because it just clogs everything for Ant. And that's like the biggest fear is having Ant just, I mean, there's some viral clips where it's like Anthony Edwards is quadruple teamed and he somehow scores and does it still, but like that's not really a formula that's going to work come playoff time.
You mentioned Jaden McDaniels already, so I want to go there for a second.
Okay.
His season has felt incredibly uneven. You already mentioned the 3-point shooting. He's at under 35% on uncontested threes, which is bad. Like I think the league average on open and wide open threes is like in the 38s this year, if I'm not mistaken. It might even be higher. Are you noticing anything specific? Is part of it just like, could it be the way that the personnel structure around him and then how that also not just impacts the spacing, but the role and the opportunity he has on the offensive end? Is it mechanics on his jumper? Like, what have you just noticed about, again, what is, I think the best word to describe his season is probably uneven, and perhaps that's even putting it kindly.
Yeah, so I kind of have a unofficial fan base for him. I've been wrong about a lot of things in basketball analysis, but one of the things I was right on was him coming out. I'm out on the West Coast, right? I went to some of his college games when he was at University of Washington. I just thought he kind of had this special skill set and was a dog defensively. You saw it again last night. There's like a 24-second possession where he just guards everyone on the Clippers, including Ty Lue. And it was exhausting to watch, but he was fantastic. He just guards PG, switches on to Norman Powell, guards him, cuts down to Zubac. He guards everyone on the team. But his shot is just super flat. He was 0 for 8 last night. He did have a couple high, scoring outputs a couple weeks ago when they needed just another guy to step up. But it's weird with him because he hasn't taken the leap. His defense to me is still pretty much there. I mean, he will probably make or will get a lot of votes for one of the two all-defensive teams. Rudy Gobert will win Defensive Player of the Year, but I think Jaden should also be on there. Ironically, I just learned this yesterday, like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who also should probably get votes, I don't think qualifies because not only is there a game, like the new award stuff, not only is there a game minimum, but there's like a minutes minimum. So I don't think Nickeil Alexander-Walker...
Is he averaging that few per game?
I think you have to average 25, and Nickeil coming off the bench, I think Nickeil's averaging like 22 or something, so that's a ramble for another day. But back to Jaden, yeah, his shot's just flat. And it makes me think, right? Like, you exert so much energy on defense. He oftentimes is just thrown out to guard a guy. I mean, you've seen Ant's defensive highlights, but those are highlights. Like, Jaden's kind of doing it the whole game, like like an offensive lineman, right? So I don't know if it's just a conditioning thing. Also, and this one's tough for people because it's not on Basketball Reference, but half the team is having like a kid. Like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Rudy Gobert, like half the team is like having, and I just don't know sometimes how that affects a young player's mentality. I know it sounds like an excuse, but maybe there's just things going on and the pressure of he knows as well that I'm going from 3. I mean, he makes this year, I think it's the 269th highest salary in the league. So he is a bargain at what he's getting paid for a starter who can lock down any guy in the league. But next year he's going to make $20 million. And he's going to jump up to like 68th. And he needs to just find more consistent offense because everyone's focused on now, and we should, because this is the greatest Timberwolves season so far in 35 years in the history of the team. But next year, if they have to make a big trade because they're in the second apron or financials, and like let's say you lose a Karl, Jaden McDaniels has to average more than 6 points a game. So right now he's making less than his own brother Jalen in Toronto, and Jaden's far better than Jalen is. But the offensive stuff, whether it be in the mid-range or just creating a little bit or just having more opportunities, if he gets more opportunities, which I've always clamored for, he has to start to deliver on them. And so far he hasn't, and it's been really, really disappointing. And luckily it hasn't hurt the team, their success, but it will come playoff time if he can't, if they're going to treat him like Rudy Gobert from the perimeter, that's a nightmare.
I can't stress enough how problematic it is if teams feel comfortable putting their bigs on him.
It's just disastrous.
Yeah. Is there anything though, like aside from the shooting that you might be watching during this catless stretch to where will they ask him to do more? Can he do more? Whether it's like kind of just more drive and kick stuff within certain lineups, or is it just like, we just need this guy to hit his wide open threes right now and we'll worry about expansion later?
He was one of the best cutters on the team, Dan, for a couple of years, and that was before Rudy got there. But now it's a little tougher because Rudy's kind of always, in that dunker spot or just hovering around the rim. So it's a little harder for Jaden to cut. But again, I don't want to make excuses. I think his defense is still, again, top 10 defensive player in the league. But offensively, it really is just hitting some shots. Now, Nickeil Alexander-Walker is a great comp because he also is just like a smaller version of Jaden. But last night he had, I think, 27 points. So he's getting to the rim a little more. He's hitting. When Nickeil Alexander-Walker takes a three, I just kind of close my eyes because I know it's going in. I think he's shooting 110% from three in big moments. It's just crazy. Like, Nickeil Alexander-Walker was not a prototypical shooting guard coming out of college, and he has weird mechanics too, but he's just refined them and he trusts his shot. So that's what makes me think a lot of it for Jaden is just mental. But last night he had multiple just corner threes, open shots, and he missed them all. And I think until he can start hitting those, it's going to be really hard for him, right? To like then drive to the basket or try to like pump fake and get to the rim or create for others. He's always had pretty good chemistry with Rudy. I think last year he was like one of the 4 highest assist totals to Rudy Gobert, but everyone only had like 6 because no one knew how to play with him. So there's more to his game. I know he has a lot of skill, but right now he's just in a mental blender and he has to just basically hit open shots because this offense, the way Finch designs this free-flowing offense, he gets shots. He gets opportunities. Last night he had, I think, 5 threes, and not one of them even hit the back rim. So I'm hopeful. I'll buy your stock if you're selling, but I also would be lying if I said I wasn't a little concerned.
Anthony Edwards. Let me ask this question. Because of how much I think Mike Conley gets a lot of credit for like bringing aspects of the Wolves offense together, his chemistry, his synergy with Rudy Gobert, that's all important. But I also kind of feel like it's overlooked at how valuable or critical Anthony Edwards is to this offense, and that people, not that they look down on him, but what he does gets diminished in the eyes of people because the Wolves offense it's been fragile, verging on not even close to elite. And then you dig into the data and it's like, well, the Wolves are winning the minutes when he plays without Mike Conley, and the offense has been lights out during those moments. So even though I didn't throw this in the outline, is there like I'm not going to say everyone on the Wolves is underrated because I asked this about Towns, but is there an underappreciation for the workload that he's shouldering and ultimately executing for this team offensively this year?
Last night, during one possession, Ty Lue threw a double team at him. I think it was maybe PG and Zubac, and Anthony Edwards just somehow dribbled around it and still got to the rim and dunked it. Like, what he's doing, it's not ideal right now. Again, Karl-Anthony Towns is, a hot button topic for many, but at least you know that when Karl's out there spaced out, he is one of the most, dangerous three-point shooters in the league, and that's going to give some gravity to give Ant more room. Without Karl, especially in these Kyle lineups, I mean, he is just driving constantly into 2 and 3 guys. I promised myself I wouldn't talk about officiating today because I think around the league it's bad, but he still kind of gets a weird whistle. He probably thinks he deserves even more of a whistle, but to answer your question simply, he deserves, I think, even more credit than he's getting, and he's getting way more now locally and nationally, but he is putting up 35 points with relative ease, and it's not, he'll have some games where it's like, I have to take 30 shots again, because there's no Karl, and I don't know who else to really trust because Mike Conley was awesome against the Clippers, but he's been even a little stagnant and had some old legs coming out of the break. So I think it really is impressive because this kid came out of Georgia as 18-year-old in that 2020 kind of COVID draft, and you didn't really know what to expect. And I'll watch a game now, Dan, whole thing start to finish. I'm like, yeah, not a great Ant game tonight. And then I'll look and it's like he had 32, 8, and 7 and did it on like 50% efficiency. So the bar that we are setting for him is incredibly high. I mean, all around All-Star time, it was, can he be the face of the league? I really think he can, because he's not only just an awesome offensive player, but you saw the block against Indiana. You saw what he did last night to Paul George. And then after the game, too, if you talk about like a face of the league, right? They interview him on TNT last night. He's taking his jersey off, and they're like, what did you see out there? And he goes, just a bunch of mismatches. You don't really get that type of truth and honesty from players in the league because they're so coached on PR. And he basically came out and said, he's like, there's no one on that team that can guard me. And that kind of is just the all-encompassing of why I think people love him so much, is that he says it, right? He kind of talks that shit, and then he backs it up as well. And that's what you want from a guy, not only for a cornerstone of your franchise, but kind of a cornerstone of like a professional sports league.
I find you even kind of alluded to this, like the efficiency without Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. We see kind of a precipitous drop in his rim finishing, his overall effective field goal percentage, which makes sense. I've always been impressed with, I guess you would call it his mindset, where it feels like he will just attack more to go downhill when Karl-Anthony
Right.
Towns is off the court. And then like the fact that he can still put up the numbers he is and not see his efficiency absolutely crater. Like you were talking about, he's seeing like 3 and 4 bodies, and he's always going to see at least 2 different lines of defenses at that point because the floor is so finitely stretched. Is there anything like what he's doing now is incredible, and the fact that he can do it is great. Is there anything the Wolves can do? Have we already talked about it, where it's pulling the Nickeil Alexander-Walker instead of Kyle Anderson lever to make life just a little bit easier on him, especially when he's going up against set? Because they've always loaded up against him, but it's getting egregious at this because they just don't care.
One thing that has come out recently, especially since Karl went out over a week ago, is Chris Finch is like many other coaches in the league now, right? That they just kind of really don't want you taking mid-range shots. So it's all threes and getting to the rim and all that type of stuff. But Finch has been pretty open about telling Ant, because Ant loves to get to his mid-range spots. One of the criticisms of Anthony Edwards so far is that since he's only 22, he doesn't really have that spot, right? Like when I watch KD late in games, you know exactly where Kevin Durant's going to go to get that shot. Same with like a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or Luka Doncic. Ant doesn't have that yet, and I think he would like it to be in the mid-range like so many of those other guys I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. But for the longest time, he wasn't really given that freedom. I think Finch saw the forest through the trees a little bit and was like, with Karl out, I just need Ant to feel comfortable wherever he wants to shoot. And as a hoops junkie, I know you know this too, like there's a real threat if you know, like the difference between a 2-level score and a 3-level score is light years, because if Ant pumps fakes from the 3-point line, the defender typically thought, okay, now he's going straight to the rim, I just have to recover all the way back. But if there's that threat that Ant's going to pull up 1 foot inside the 3-point line or just hit that mid-range, which has become kind of his bread and butter, it makes him unguardable. So I know that's not the exact answer to your point about what can do around him. I just think empowering him to be like, hey man, at this point, this is kind of all about you. And if you're going to give that type of performance on defense and make these types of plays, we're going to let you kind of shoot as much as you want and from wherever you want. Because again, Jaden, Kyle, all these other guys, like Naz is great, Nickeil is great, Mike's been better, but the best option a lot of times is just Anthony Edwards taking the shot. That's like the best offense right now, and it has worked, mostly not only this last week, but this whole season. So surrounding him with more shooting would obviously be helpful because it just gets that gravity. He does love to get to the rim. He does love to dunk on guys, and he's a really good free throw shooter. So spacing is big, but I also just think saying, hey man, wherever you think the best shot is on this possession, go take it.
Do you think then that Towns' absence can sort of embolden him in a way that it hasn't been before? Because I wouldn't call him an over-deferential player, but he does go through stretches where it feels like he can be overly deferential. Now it's like, well, dude, who are you deferring to? Like, I know Mike Conley's good. Like, they have good players on this team, but there's no real second option. Like, if you looked right now and said, who's the Timberwolves' second best scorer? The answer might be Naz Reid.
Mm-hmm. You've asked a lot of good questions. That's the best question you've asked. And it's, if you watch the last week of Wolves games, so I'm talking Indiana, Cleveland, Lakers, and Clippers, the most notable thing since Karl went out, and I don't know if this is also just personal life related or what, Ant doesn't smile as much, and he's like more not frowning, but like he just looks more locked in, and like Reggie Miller said last night, like real dog mentality. We just haven't seen, like after that Pacers game, people that cover the team, people that are around this kid every day, they haven't seen that level of like emotional exertion. Like he is really locked in and like wants to win. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Karl was holding him back, but those two are really tight, and the differential is like they both kind of, what movie is that with Will Ferrell where they just keep passing the ball back and forth to each other?
Semi-pro.
Yeah, so like that's how Karl and Ant have handled situations where it's like, no, man, you take it. No, you take it. And they just pass back and forth. And now it's a shot clock violation. Without Karl, Ant kind of knows. Ant probably knew it was his team before Karl went down, but now he's like, this is my team. And I think that allows him to just be, he was fearless when he entered the league in 2020, but somehow he's become even more fearless and not having to really defer or know in big spots like, hey, it's just going to be you. Like you said, every other player on this roster right now is probably plus money to score 20 points. Naz Reid would be the favorite, but like on any given night, I would not bet my life that any other player on the team is going to score 20 points. So, yeah. And knowing that the burden is on him and he loves a challenge, he loves that type of stuff. Him and Finch have such a cool relationship that, yeah, I think he just knows now his best chance to win a title is probably with Karl-Anthony Towns alongside him. But until Karl comes back, he's like, I can do this. You're not by myself. I don't want to say it like that, but I can do this with a larger load. And so far, he's kind of delivered on both sides of the floor.
Naz Reid is inching closer towards becoming a household name. I mean, people who listen to this podcast, who listen to your two podcasts, they know who Naz Reid is, but he's now like in the lexicon of just known NBA players. He's had a couple monster performances already, and Towns only been out, 4 games now? So he's already had like a couple monster performances. What has impressed you either during that mini stretch or just in general about his growth or continued development this season?
Again, hyperbolic to those who do not follow the team on a daily basis. But Naz Reid is the greatest developmental story in the history of the Minnesota Timberwolves, and that one's not even close.
Leonard Miller pending, right?
Leonard Miller pending. Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate you. He got some minutes last night. No, he was a highly touted high school prospect. He goes to LSU. He actually did a pretty fun interview with Worldwide Wob, so if you go check that out on Twitter. I thought it was actually NBA players in general don't do a lot of interviews right now unless you're on a podcast, so to hear Naz's story a little more, it was cool. But undrafted, I always joke that he couldn't jump over the free throw line. It's not that he couldn't jump from it. He couldn't jump over it, and that thing's painted on the floor. He just wasn't athletic. He was kind of a poor man's Karl-Anthony Towns when Gerson Rosas, at that point, the president of the team, brought him in. He has put so much time into his body that not only, I think he's shooting, Dan, like as of this morning, 42% from 3. So he has hit that poor man's Karl-Anthony Towns part, but he's also gone from being an undersized 5 to, and again, give me a little leeway here because it's been an early morning, but he's kind of like a Paolo Banchero, like Carmelo Anthony. Like he's just like a physical wing now. He's not nearly as good as either of those guys, but his ability, he might have the best big man handle in the league. Like his ability to kind of go in and out dribble. He loves to dunk on guys. He is a 6'10", center that's probably best position is playing the 3. So his developmental story, Karl goes out, Naz comes in and immediately gives you multiple 20-point games. He's physical. His defense has gotten better. It's not all the way there yet, but he's only, I think, 23 or 24. So he is a core part of this franchise. And it was less than a year ago at this time when the writing was kind of on the wall that the Wolves thought they might lose him, or the fan base thought they would lose him because of the financial situation. You had 2 centers making $100 million. But Tim Conley got the job done, signed him here, and I think Naz Reid will be here for a long time. But he is, despite what I just said about Ant, and I basically crowned him president, I think Naz Reid is the highest Q scorer in the fan base, and people name their cats after him. Like, people love Naz Reid.
Yeah, you and I talked extensively actually leading into the season about his floor game, which I actually think, even though there might be, it's been kind of, I think he's shooting like 58% on drive since Karl-Anthony Towns went down, but he's still at like 54% for the season. And they're like, to me, anecdotally, they look like more contested drives, whereas you have to get through maybe multiple layers of defense now where you're not just attacking on closeouts and through all this wide open space. That's huge. And then you mentioned the defense. I think he's a really good defender. Like when you're 6'10" and can move on the perimeter like he does, and I know he's insulated a little bit in certain lineups, and the numbers when he is your only big have not been great, but like he's even improved his like kind of straight up rim protection when it comes to that. And so this is just to get him on the contract that they did is a huge win. I wonder if like him getting injured kind of lowered his price point at all towards the end of last season, where that might have helped the Wolves out, not Naz. Because saying he's on one of the best contracts in the league is a compliment and an insult, because he doesn't want to be on one of the best contracts. He wants to be on a better one, but he has been so good. And I almost wonder, the way that he's going to play during this last part of the season, if it's just going to fuel the whole like Karl-Anthony Towns like trade discourse where it's like, oh, it's gonna be fun watching Naz Reid play. But I felt like we were finally, well, the trade deadline passed for one, but we were kind of finally removed from like that whole, even people have pulled back on the second apron stuff where it's all right, they'll eventually have to make a decision, maybe, but is it really going to come before next year's trade deadline or before the end of next season? And my answer has always been no, for the most part, when asked about that. But he is so good that I think some people are going to take it and run with it that way, which again is a compliment and then almost just like an exasperated, oh, should we brace for this again? But I've been so impressed with what he's been able to do over this mini stretch, but just all season to where it almost feels like it's not that it's flown under the radar, but because the story is this dual big stuff with these two expensive bigs, it has flown under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, and to your point, you're probably right. I think covering a team that has been the best defense by a mile all season, I sometimes forget that like my standards now for good defense are higher than maybe most.
I didn't know the minutes thing I knew there was a minutes. I didn't know that he was so below it. And you were right. He's at like 23 a game or whatever it is. But like when we did our all defensive teams, I think it was like a week or two ago, he didn't make it for either one of my co-hosts, right? But like we mentioned him. It's like, to your point, the Wolves had Jaden McDaniels, right. And even we might have mentioned Anthony Edwards and Rudy Gobert was there. And so it's like the fact that you're just going down the ladder and you're mentioning, I get what you're saying then about your standards just being through the roof.
It's like when you'd watch MTV Cribs and someone would have like 9 sweet cars in their garage. By the 8th car, you're like, yeah, that car is cool too. It's like Nikhil's great at defense, but it's like I'm holding it to Jaden and Rudy standards. No, on Naz, you're right. I think the defense that I would like to see improved a little more is I just said he went from being an undersized 5 to like this mega physical 3, and even had that really cool block to end regulation against Garland against Cleveland when he was completely ISO'd. He knew what Garland was going to do. I mean, how many times do you see a guy take a game-winning shot and get it blocked, and Naz just blocks Garland and they have a chance, they run a dumb play, they lose the game. But yeah, I think just having a little, he's decreased a lot of his body fat. He's gotten small. He's become more of a wing, so it is a little hard for him to guard real traditional 5s or even more traditional 4s, but he's been great. I have never thought of that, what you just said, and I'm totally with you. He broke his wrist about this time last year, trying to again yam on someone in Phoenix, and which forced him to miss the playoffs. And it might have been, unfortunately for Naz, the best thing to happen to the Timberwolves because they basically could just kind of bubble wrap him and hide him in the closet. They ended up getting an agreement done before they let Naz even test free agency, but he loves it here. He has kind of been one of the impetuses of guys staying in Minnesota in the summer to keep working out. So not only do they have this cool core of like an Ant 22, Jaden 23, Naz 24, Nikhil 25, but those guys like want to hang out and work out together in the summer. And one thing, if you knew about the Timberwolves, is that as soon as the season was done, all 15 players would get as far away from Minnesota as they could. So Naz has just been like a cultural impact as well. I know that sounds kind of cliche, but Naz Reid's impact on the court and off the court has been massive. He's a fan favorite. And to your other point about maybe being the replacement for Karl down the road, him and Rudy were, I think, one of the 2 or 3 worst 2-man lineups when you looked at the stats last season. And this year, it's just completely flipped. So the fact that he can also play with Rudy is big because of what you just said. I'm not super concerned yet about second apron stuff. As of today, the Wolves are like close to the finish line on this new ownership transition where Mark Lowry and Alex Rodriguez are due to pay their final payment at the end of this month. It's like they would take over the keys of the franchise, and then they're going to be faced with big tax bills. But yeah, I think he's shown you enough in a limited sample this last week that if they decide they have to pivot off a big contract, he can step in and be a bona fide 82-game starter.
And I'm rooting for them not to like view him as a replacement. And I'm just, I don't want to turn this into a tax discussion because they're so good, but it's just they have until next season. Correct. If they want to. They're not going to get out of it, but if they want to save money, they have until the end of next season. And so if they're that concerned about it, unless something disastrous happens this year that's not injury related and they're just so bad in the postseason, I'm all for you let it roll and you just figure out the rest later, or at least just stomach it for a year. But yeah, and you mentioned, by the way, the lineup data, the only like, and this is a testament to what Karl-Anthony Towns, I think, has done this year. The only like bad big man data, I think, at this point is Naz by himself, if I'm not mistaken.
And that's his thing. He's become like he can't play just the 5. So that's like the only thing. But again, in a perfect world, when you're paying $100 million to 2 players that have been all NBA centers in Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns, you don't really want Naz to be a center. But it just so happens that now he kind of gets thrown into that mold because they're down a big guy. But yeah, he can't really play center anymore, which is fine because you have two really good ones, but he's an awesome wing. And again, I apologize to a Carmelo or Apollo or even LeBron, not comparing him to him, but just physically the way he can move on the perimeter offensively and defensively. It's just something you don't really see that often from a big guy.
This question just feels like it rings hollow after Mike Conley goes kaboom against the Clippers.
No, that's good. No, you're good.
But was there any concern? He kind of has like that rough stretch where he actually looks the age of 36. Is there a level of long-term concern there? Is it just, well, once Monte Morris is healthy and like we won't have to lean on maybe Mike Conley as much? Just what did you kind of make or notice about that? It was like, I don't know, it was like 7 or 8 games just coming out of the All-Star break, basically, where he just looked so old.
It's a great question. He is 36. And my goal throughout the season and preseason predictions and stuff was like, hey, I wonder if Nickeil will play more minutes total and average than Mike. Because I thought back in September and October, this team will just try to manage Mike's minutes, have him play 60-ish games, and just try to keep him fresh for the playoffs. What I've learned covering him and being around Mike a little bit, that he might be the most competitive player on the team. And I don't know if that's an age thing because he sees the end of the line for him compared, Ant's going to be in the league for another 15 years. Mike knows his time is limited, and he wants to add a ring to what could be a Hall of Fame career. I mean, just based on his longevity and how many good teams he's been on.
Makes it. I would think
yeah. I mean, I think the basketball Hall of Fame, you and I are getting close to making it too. So, but Mike's got a good case, but he wants to win, and a lot of times when it's that shoot around meeting between the medical staff and Mike and Chris Finch. Two parties, Finch and the medical staff, like, hey, Mike, we'd love you to sit tonight. Just rest up. We can fill your spot. And he's adamant about playing. Like, he wants to play every game. So it's like a double-edged sword, right? Like, you love that because Mike Conley is stable and a veteran and kind of a floor general. But then it's like, how many miles can you put on the leg odometer? So he came out of All-Star break, ironically, when you have that break, kind of stagnant and didn't really find his groove. He had a couple games where he did kind of get it, then a couple games where he fell off. I mean, listen to Bill Simmons on Sunday with Russillo. They were like talking about how that might be one of the worst trades, even though Mike Conley took a 50% pay cut moving forward for the team. And then last night, man, it's like, what are you worried about? Look at him. He just hit, I think it was 7 threes. 2 of them were taken off the board because they were long twos. But when he is going, I'm not a big left-handed shooter fan. I'm just going to admit that now. It always looks aesthetically displeasing to me. But when he's cooking, this offense, the sky is the limit because that's just another guy that spaces the floor. And with the way Nickeil shot, so you got Nickeil on one end, you got Mike on the other, and Ant just has this clearly into the basket. The Mike Conley thing to me is the number one player I want to know how healthy he is or how productive he's going to be for the playoffs, even more than Karl, because without Mike, Jordan McLaughlin off the bench has been great. Monty Morris will come back, but Mike Conley has been the straw that stirs the drink all season, and without him, I do kind of think they would be lost.
Are there any, and we talked about this a little bit, but moving forward, are there any lineups now without Towns that you're hoping Finch will get to, whether it's, do we want to see, we've seen a little bit of it, but not a ton, Conley and Morris playing together, or now all of a sudden the whole, well, if Kyle Anderson's just our point guard when Mike Conley might be off, like during the non-Conley, or just any lineups that you would like to see more of or any of if we haven't seen them yet?
Yeah, I love Mike being out there, and I love Naz. I should start with that. So I love Naz Reid. Any lineup Naz is in is good, but I'm really excited to see, and I think maybe it'll be the starters on Saturday, is like a Mike, Nickeil, Ant, Jaden, Rudy lineup. You would think like, oh, Jaden at the 4 hasn't been great. You're right. Jaden at the 4 has never been great. He's not a great rebounder. But Anthony Edwards has been just guarding centers recently. Like, he just loves to take the challenge. A couple games where I got to think of who it was, but he was just like, I'm just going to guard that big guy. And he did a great job of like kind of shutting him down. So I think Ant at like the 4 almost, with just his physicality and his way of playing defense, would be awesome. But I really just want to see a team. The biggest issue, Dan, from the Wolves all season has been they are the best defense in the league. That usually translates to the playoffs. But you kind of got to be top 10-ish on both sides of the ball if you want to be a contender. And the Wolves haven't even sniffed 10. Like, at best, they've been like 15th or 16th. So they have to find ways to be more creative on offense. That's also on Chris Finch, who I love, but like installing more structure sometimes rather than just free-flowing, everyone figure it out. Because this team has vets, Mike Conley, Kyle Anderson, Rudy Gobert, but they have a lot of youth still, whether you like it or not. Ant and Jaden and Nickeil, they haven't been in a lot of winning situations. So maybe instead of youth, you call it inexperience. But I just want to see them tinker and find as much shooting as they can on the perimeter to give Ant the runway to kind of be a, come playoff time, man, you've seen this before. Like, why couldn't Anthony Edwards average 38 a game in the playoffs? Like, that seems pretty normal now, the way you watch him play. So just any lineup that gives him more spacing, and probably any lineup that takes Kyle Anderson off the floor is kind of where I've come to be at this point.
That's it. When you mentioned simplifying the offense, do you think there's room maybe then, like you can get to certain lineups? Perhaps it's with, certainly when Kyle Anderson's not on the court, where you could just run maybe more spread pick and roll, because this isn't like a super, even though they have Rudy Gobert, like this isn't just a super pick and roll heavy team when you watch them or when you dig into the data for it.
And like Chris Finch doesn't want that. Like Chris Finch does not want to coach the classic like James Harden Rockets team that's just all pick and roll. Like, I don't think Chris Finch would like to coach the Mavericks. I don't think he wants to coach Luka and just how heavy, usage rate one player is or two players. Now, granted, Ant's usage rate is skyrocketing without Karl, but he still
his
wants
touches, when you look at like the front court touches since Towns went down, are just like, I think they're infinity at this point.
But it's not a real number. So I do think Finch, and you're starting to see a little bit more. That's one of the criticisms that all fans and people covering the team have had, is Finch doesn't install enough structure at times when the team probably needs it, and gives them too much of a leash to kind of figure it out themselves. So I would hope that Finch, to kind of answer your question, calls a little more plays or has a little more sets that just get these guys either moving or cutting, just creating more chaos on offense, because Ant has shown that he's pretty good in chaos. But it'll be interesting to see what they do these last 18 or so games, because you don't want to show too many cards, right, for the playoffs. But in the same vein, you've seen enough sample size now that you have to do something different offensively, because your defense could be all world come playoff time, but it's still an offensive league. Even with the rule changes and all that stuff going on right now, like, it's still, can you outscore your opponent in certain chunks of a game? And the Wolves still have that as kind of their Achilles heel right now.
So when you're just kind of looking at the rest of this season, and you've probably dug way more into the schedule for them than I have, and they do have, I think they're +3 games at home. They have 3 more home games than away games moving forward. Just how much of a slog do you expect this stretch to be? Do you expect them now, especially if that went over the Clippers and knowing the tiebreaker stuff, for them to maintain a top 3 spot? Do you see a scenario where they could drop to 4th, or maybe, even as we're recording this, like the Pelicans are surging and they're technically only 4 losses behind the Wolves? Like, what are your gut feelings in that sense?
Again, this is the beauty in doing this on the 13th rather than the 12th, because yesterday I was pretty much on board with, like, I feel like they're going to fall to 4. That space that they gave themselves now with the Clippers, and some of these tiebreakers too, I don't have them all on me, and not all of them are solidified, but the Wolves are starting to like clinch the tiebreakers with various teams in the standings as well, which will be beneficial. But yeah, as we wake up today, they're 0.5 games out of the 1 seed. OKC and Denver are tied in first and second, and the Wolves are 3 games up on the Clippers. I do see, they have 3 games left against Denver, and Denver is just, in my opinion, the best team in the West again. They've kind of turned it on and are unstoppable. But this road trip they're on is a 6-game road trip. 4 of the games were really tough against all playoff teams, Indiana, Cleveland, Lakers, and Clippers. And now they go play 2 in Utah, but they have a couple extra days off. So I've watched enough Utah games just as a hater because of the connection between them and Minnesota with the Rudy Gobert and all the picks they owe. So I love when Utah loses. Sorry, Jazz fans, but I think if they can just get
Utah loves when Utah loves when Utah loses right now.
I was hoping they would go 500 on this road trip. That's a 3-3. They're already now 2-2. So I think they just got to steal one of these games in Utah. They do then go home and have a second night of a back-to-back against the Nuggets that I'm sure they'll drop. But the schedule has enough kind of easier teams. I think they play the Rockets, the Bulls, and the Wizards at home in a stretch. They're, I think, the best team in the league at home. Them or OKC. I think they're 23-8 at home. Target Center's been a really tough place for opponents to play. So I'm not concerned about them anymore, especially after last night falling, because this team, this is kind of the fan side of me, but they've shown so much heart. Again, last night you're down 22 in LA. You're going to get to go to the beach in the morning. Why not just let it go? And they didn't let it go. They fought back and had maybe the most statement win of the season. So I totally expect them to have home court, which would mean they have a top 4 seed. And I totally expect them to flirt with 1 or 2, but I would say that they're more comfortably going to be the 3 seed now, because Denver, I think, has the easiest schedule in the league, and the Thunder are kind of this unprecedented wagon that just every time you expect them to lose, they don't. So they're better than the Clippers. They're better than the Pelicans, I think. I've trusted the Pelicans enough, Dan, that like just when you trust them, they let you down. So for now, I see them finishing probably third in the West and would make for a great matchup against a Kings or a Suns or whoever kind of gets that sixth spot.
The Pelicans are, I've said it a few times, that they are my kink. I think about them. I can't quit them.
That's a great way to put it.
They eventually feel like they burn you. But that leads me to my next question. When you're looking at prospective matchups, maybe in the first round or just in general, if you're trying to look deeper into the playoffs, are there any teams, one or two, that in particular, and the obvious answer just might be, even though they did play them really well, but like Denver for everybody still, as well as the Wolves might have played them last year. But is there like any just one or two teams that you find maybe it's just compelling or you think would be a particularly difficult matchup for this team? And it could be, you could frame it as even if they have Towns or especially if they don't have Towns, however you want to roll with it.
I just want everyone who's listening to this that isn't a Timberwolves fan, that might be a fan of another Western Conference team. I don't pretend to watch nearly as many of your games as I do my own teams, but I think the Wolves are best matchup suited for a team that's kind of heavy ISO. So not to say that the teams like the Suns or the Mavs don't run plays, but we've seen before. I mean, there was a viral clip of last year when Jaden McDaniels and Ant were just basically on an island against Kyrie and Luka in a last-second situation. All 24 seconds of the shot clock, they defended, and they didn't get a shot off, and they won the game. I think those types of teams, not only that are a little more ISO-centric, like a Phoenix maybe, or Dallas, but also don't have a ton of size. Like, my concern for the Suns, and they're a fun team to watch, is that, like, Yusuf Nurkic gets 110% of all their rebounds, and if you can just get him off the court, like, you can probably crush that team in, like, just a rebounding advantage, and that's something that the Wolves have lost playoff series against Memphis because they couldn't rebound. So I kind of like the Suns. I know that sounds crazy and I'll get made fun of down the road, but I like the Suns. I like the Mavs. I don't like the Pelicans. I know I might have just taken a shot at them, but they are my kink as well. Like when they're on, I don't know if there's a better team in the West other than Denver. So, and they're physical and they have shot makers and they have guys that can defend in space. So give me like a Dallas Mavericks team that might be, having some issues, or like maybe they're one of those teams that blows it up this summer. Give me a Suns team. Don't give me a Lakers team. That's my biggest fear, because it's the Lakers, right? Like from a Wolves perspective.
My whole thing is I want one of these, whether it's the Thunder, whether it's the Wolves. Like I just want one of these like sort of newer teams to just beat the Lakers or the Warriors handily, so we could move on with how deep of a playoff run are they going to make. That look, LeBron James, I think is the greatest basketball player of all time, one of my favorite players of all time. But just like we got to stop, not you, but like we got to stop pretending that like one of these teams can go on some hellfire run. It's not happening.
But no, great point. Not only I'm with you on the LeBron stuff, but the Lakers also do have like size and physicality, not just AD, but like LeBron and Rui, and like they have all these big guys. So, like the Wolves, I said they have an identity of size. It's kind of neutralized against a team like the Lakers. But then also too, I've said the greatest thing so many times, but the greatest trade, without a doubt, hands down, in Minnesota Timberwolves history was 13 months ago when they traded D'Angelo Russell for Mike Conley and Nickeil Alexander-Walker and 3 second-round picks, one of which they used to get our best friend Leonard Miller. So I don't I
don't know if I told you this during the preseason pod we did. I destroyed that trade from the Wolves' perspective because I was such a believer in D'Lo and what he was doing.
Oh, interesting. That's fair.
I was clearly wrong. I've eaten crow for it 10 times over when Grant and I talk about it. That's one of the bigger misses I've had. I miss a lot, Kyle, but that's one of the bigger misses I've had over the past year.
And you know what? As fans of this pod, like I appreciate you just being honest, because I said I've missed way more than I've made. It was weird too, because at the time it did seem like a weird trade. You're trading for a 35-year-old Mike Conley, and who's this Nickeil kid? Like he was basically out of the rotation in a Utah team that was not trying to really win games. But that trade worked out so well. And D'Lo is having, to his credit, a really great year for the Lakers. But there is just something about the mentality of a Wolves fan having to watch like Game 6, D'Lo has 35 and he's doing ice in the veins, and him and Vando are dapping it up. Like there's too many former Timberwolves on that Lakers team that like that's not, if I'm going to lose, I want to lose to like Luka, who's putting up 62 points a game. It can't be the Lakers, and it definitely can't be the Warriors because they've got Wiggins. That was the other trade, right? Wiggins for Russell. And then the Draymond angle, he hates kind of all the Timberwolves. Like he hates Karl, he chokes Rudy. Just don't want that either. So let someone else sweep them. I'm totally with you. Like let's get those teams out of the playoffs ASAP. But give me a lesser, maybe smaller market team for my small market team to go against.
I would say I make fun of the Warriors, but like between the two of them, I wouldn't want to face them. I'd rather face the Lakers because it feels like the Warriors like their peak, if they can sustain it for like a couple weeks, would be more dangerous. I agree with you on the Pelicans, especially if they don't have Cat. Just looking at their size and their length and their physicality. I can't remember what podcast I was listening to, and what am I missing here? But someone said the Kings, that the Timberwolves shouldn't want to see, and it wasn't a Kings podcast. I promise it wasn't a Kings podcast.
I wonder. Yeah, I mean, I think the Kings or the Wolves match up pretty well against the Kings again with the size thing. The Kings obviously love to get out and transition, and the Wolves are one of the slower paced teams. They're kind of neutral to me. To me, if I was looking at a Western Conference like brother, they're like, along with the Wolves, have never maybe gotten the respect they get. They're really fun, smaller markets. So I think it'd be a great series. Again, back to my 20 years of pain and misery. 03-04 was the last time the Wolves won a playoff series. They go to the Western Conference Finals. They lose to that star-studded Laker team that's not just Kobe and Shaq, but also Karl Malone and Gary Payton. But that year they beat, who was pretty much their biggest rival, that Kings team with like Chris Webber and Stojakovic and all those guys. So Wolves, Kings again, one team gets to finally advance to the second round would be a great storyline. But I think I'm net neutral on them. I'm not concerned. The Pelicans again, like the Wolves have all these great defenders, Rudy, Nikhil, Jaden, Ant, but no one that can guard Zion. Like there's just a weird kind of enigma that they don't have a big guy that can guard a Zion. Few do, but the Wolves definitely don't. So kind of want to avoid the Pelicans, and that's why I always keep coming back to like a Suns team or a Mavericks team.
By the way, shout out to the Clippers defense for making the Wolves transition offense look pretty potent.
They looked like they were running sprints last night. That was impressive. James Harden is having nightmares for sure.
So assuming Towns is out through round one, I'm letting you pick the Wolves' opponent for the first round. Who would be your final pick then for that?
I mean, God, this podcast is popular enough that people will pull these receipts and come back to me. I think it's the Mavs. I just don't really like. I love Chris Finch, but I think there are teams in the league that are better coached, probably like OKC, right? Chris Finch is just a way better basketball coach than Jason Kidd. And I like the Mavs. I have Mavs friends, but he would outcoach Jason Kidd. And then the Mavs would have the best player in the series, which is always, like in football, right? When there's a game, like, well, who has the best quarterback? I'm just going to take them. But from 2 to 7, maybe 2 to 6, I don't want to disrespect Kyrie Irving, but the Wolves would have like the 2nd through 6th best players. And then the size, I just don't know if the Wolves would look at a Dallas team and be that concerned. And they would just basically be like, we're going to make every other player beat us except for Lucas. So that's kind of always been one I've starred, but I also would be kidding myself. And this depends on where the Wolves finish themselves. But from basketball junkies like ourselves, can you imagine a 7, 8, 9, 10 that's like Phoenix, Dallas, Lakers, and Warriors, and those are the play-in games? Like, and 2 of those teams aren't going to make it.
What's the point of getting the 1 or the 2 seed at that point? A little bit.
And that's why, again, I'm probably coping as a guy who covered a team that was in first place for, a chunk of this marathon. But I don't think finishing 3rd is bad. Now, it's bad if you're trying to come out of the West because, again, you're going to have to go into Denver, go into OKC or whatever. But I think 3 might be like a sneaky spot to finish, right? Because you get to kind of play a team that maybe has some issues, but you're not going to have to play one of these. Again, it's weird, right? Because the Mavs and Suns are just playing better basketball than the Lakers or Warriors, but it's the Lakers or Warriors. And until someone stomps them out, there's always going to be that kind of championship pedigree that makes you nervous.
The benefit of 3, by the way, and I know it's not huge, but like your playoff matchup at least a couple days earlier. I find that so strange that you're the 1 seed and you're like, don't find out your playoff matchup. Then if you're the 2 seed, like, you narrow it down to 2 teams, but you're still kind of billowing in the wind for a minute.
Yeah, Chris Finch mentioned that last year because this has been a play-in team, for the most couple of years. But how difficult it is as a play-in team to just have less time to scout. And I think if you're on the inverse of that and you're a top 4 team or top 3, if 3 or 4, knowing who you're going to play and having 4 extra days to scout them is easier than trying to scout, 3 or 4 play-in teams.
Now, this isn't a second apron. I guess it's second apron adjacent question, but it's also just a matter of when you go all in on a Rudy Gobert trade, when you trade for a Mike Conley, when you pay Karl-Anthony Towns what you paid him. This is just a natural progression to here. There's urgency to figure out how good this team is in the postseason. Does that calculus change at all following the Karl-Anthony Towns injury? Whereas do they now have a built-in excuse if things go awry in the playoffs? Or is this still sort of, well, we have Naz Reid, Anthony Edwards is ready now, we made these moves, like we still have to read into, even if Towns doesn't come back, we lose in round 1, we still have to read deeply into the results that take place during the postseason.
And it's the best point of all the really good points you've made so far is that there's no real reason to talk about the second apron stuff, not only because I don't think the whole league understands it. Like, for example, there are 7 teams, and they're all, pretty bad or bottom tier teams that have cap space this summer, like the Detroits, the Charlottes, the Spurs.
They're all going to be competing to overpay Tobias Harris. It's going to be
right, and someone will, yeah. And Tobias will. Tobias is like the Kirk Cousins of the NBA getting paid, but there's so many other teams that are going to have financial issues, right? Like there's not many teams. You're not going to see a team just trade for Karl-Anthony Towns into their cap space. But to the second apron conversation, a lot of these teams think they know what they have and have a 5-year plan, and then they're going to get punched in the mouth in the playoffs or have a really successful run, and that will determine everything. So I can't predict what the Wolves will do this summer because I want to see what they do in the playoffs. But for a team, again, that has never made it out of the first round since Kevin Garnett in 03-04, a first-round playoff series win and advancement is a big deal. And that's silly to a Knicks fan or a Celtics fan or whatever, but well, maybe not a Knicks fan.
I was going to say, it's not silly to a Knicks fan.
but to a Celtics fan, but like that is a big step for them. And for this Rudy Gobert experiment to work, it's going to involve multiple playoff runs. And this will be a playoff run. And then you guys kind of figure out, who your second round matchup is. If they get bounced out of the first round and Karl doesn't play, I'm an excuse maker. So I would be like, you know what? Run it back. New ownership. The team has gone like up $1 billion since the layaway plan started 24 months ago. They can probably afford it. But I could also see them being like, no, we want to run it back. Or we want to change, or we want to run it back. So there's 2 paths for them to go. I think it'll all determine what happens in late April, early May, with or without Karl. But their goal has to be, especially with home court and being so good at home, their goal has to be winning one playoff series. And then most people won't like this, but then it is kind of house money. Like it's, what can you do, against a Denver, against an OKC, or maybe the Suns are good at that point too. So it's going to be really interesting. But for now, I don't really care about the financials because the play on the court will determine
I first of all don't think fans, they should recognize it. But like fans shouldn't care about it. That's not their job. I will say, if Karl-Anthony Towns is back and looks anything like Karl-Anthony Towns, any team that they are playing outside of Denver, like I'm going to, and OKC is tough, but it's just like, I have expectations for this team because I was pretty high on them. We loved the Rudy Gobert trade on this podcast, and we looked like idiots.
Good. Look at you.
For a good part of last year. But the way that they've played this year, even with how shaky the offense has been, this is a team at full strength that I think should be held to that championship contender standard. And so the Karl-Anthony Towns injury, that excuse is there. But if you have like your full supporting, if you have your full cast, and Karl-Anthony Towns is even 75% of Karl-Anthony Towns, like, this is a team that yes, there's that level of house money. I agree from the fan experience, but they are good enough for us to expect more and to criticize them accordingly if that happens in the postseason. I will also say, though, I think relative to national consensus, I am higher on what they can do in the playoffs at full strength, where everyone wants to focus on, well, how's this defense going to hold up in the postseason? You know what? I'm not going to say the Rudy Gobert storylines in the playoffs are a myth, but like the defense is going to be fine. Even during the worst series of his playoff career, like that Clippers Jazz series, they had figured it out by the end of it. It was the Jazz's offense that kind of betrayed them there, unless I'm misremembering correctly. And so I had a lot of faith in this team. It's just the Karl-Anthony Towns injury changes the complexion of everything for me, because even if he does come back, knowing it's like how important the meniscus is, that part that he injured, to the mobility and the weight bearing exercise of it. And now he's playing the 4 and has had to defend different types of guys. What does he look like when he comes back? So I think that's fair. But this team is, and I don't think anyone needs to hear this right now, but if anybody does, they're fucking incredible. They are super dangerous. And I am going to hold them to a standard accordingly.
And I should say, I was pretty like apologetic. And again, if you're a Timberwolves fan like myself, you're just always building in coping mechanisms, because it's March 13th and I'm usually just on tankathon. Like, I'm not used to being like, what seed are they going to get like on the top? I'm more like, what seed are they going to get on the bottom? But if they flame out in the first round, regardless, with Karl or without, they're going to be heavily criticized, and they deserve to be heavily criticized, because again, this has been the best season so far, but it's not going to really matter unless they can finally break that ceiling and be like, we won a playoff series. I mean, it was a big deal for them to make the playoffs a couple of years ago, because like the Pat Bev play-in game celebration thing, it was silly to most, but when you're the team that in all 4 professional sports has had the longest playoff drought, it's kind of nice to get off that list. This would be the next list for them to get off of, is like advancing to the second round, however it may come, is a really big deal. And it'll solidify that the Gobert trade, for some teams, if you're the Celtics and you trade for Gobert and you give up all that, you're trying to win multiple banners. For the Wolves and you give up that price, you're just trying to be a competent conference finals team like 1 out of 4 years.
Is there anyone else I didn't ask you about that you think needs to be discussed before I let you go? Any Leonard Miller first ballot Hall of Fame takes that you need to get off?
Since we last spoke in like October, Leonard Miller has had kind of an up and down. He, I don't know how much G League you watch. I do.
I see Leonard Miller. Maybe they were retweeted by you onto my feed, but like I've seen
Probably.
Leonard Miller G League highlights throughout the season.
No, I think Leonard Miller, he's tied into like the Josh Minot thing. This team under Tim Conley has made just some of the best trades ever. Like you love the Gobert trade. It's clearly worked out. The Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Mike Conley trade has worked out. He signed Naz Reid. He signed Jaden. He signed Ant. But the next generation of what this team could look like moving forward, they haven't really done anything or gotten any production out of their young guys. And I'm just interested to kind of monitor that. That has nothing to do with the hour pod we just did now, but it will be interesting to see, you look around the league and like the Nuggets or the Thunder, the Nuggets, for example, like with Watson and some of these guys, they kind of integrate and fold in these young guys to be part of their core and their cheap contracts. That's been really good. The Wolves are going to have to find a way to do that. They won't give any of the young guys minutes the rest of this season, whether you agree with that or not. But I'm already thinking, and this is just the sicko in me, Dan, I'm excited for Summer League. I'm excited to go watch like some of these guys. Again, I just said I need a break from basketball. And now I'm like, hey, you know what? Actually, I can't wait to go to Vegas for a week and watch these guys. But no, I think we hit on everyone. It's a really fun season. I always appreciate coming on. But if you're looking for a team that is just, if you're just a general NBA fan, I'm biased, but it's a pretty likable team, right? Like it's a lot of guys, they really gel. They're all having baby showers again because like half the team is expecting their first kid.
No, you mentioned that's like sleep is hard to come by, and I know that players technically have more time on their hands than most of us, but when you're throwing a kid into the equation, like the lack of sleep and the recovery that you should in theory need for this type of job, when you mentioned that, I didn't think you were crazy at all. I was like, I didn't know how many of them were having kids. But that's certainly, I would think, a factor.
Some of my close friends that cover the team were in Indiana for that game the other night. That was, again, just must watch. Turn the lights down low, pour a glass of wine, and watch what Ant does in the fourth. But he has that crazy game, crazy production on offense, game sealing block, and then they go into the locker room and Ant could be overheard on the phone talking to his girlfriend about like how to position the car seat in the car. And it's just like that type of stuff, right? That we don't really focus on. We're not privy to, but Anthony Edwards was probably the most popular athlete in the world for an hour last Thursday, and he was just kind of consumed with his child that's been around for two weeks. So it's a really cool team that if you're just looking for a bandwagon to hop on, there's plenty of seats still. But it's a cool team that I'm hopeful as a fan can make a little run because there's nothing I believe more than like this fan base has gotten the least ROI on their investment for the last 20 years, and no one deserves it, even organizational members of the players. No one deserves having a fun April and May more than Timberwolves fans. So it'll be fun to watch coming down the stretch.
Kyle, thank you as always for giving me 70 plus minutes.
Anytime, man.
Timberwolves. Are you able just to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the fantastic hashtag content that you put out?
Yeah, so I help run Dane Moore's NBA podcast, which is like the best, I think the best team-specific podcast of all the teams. So if you want Timberwolves stuff every day from all the beat writers, Dane Moore NBA podcast, I help produce that. And then I do Flagrant Howls over at Score North. It's kind of fun. I know you're a hoops junkie, so like Jim Peterson, who is
that pod was fun. That was really cool.
He's kind of known as one of the best broadcasters in the league. Him and Michael Grady. We have Jim on every Thursday, and he played in the league. He's from Minnesota. He coached WNBA like 4-time Lynx championship. So he's a cool perspective to have on. We just have a lot of fun with it. So I'm at Kyle Tigey on Twitter. That website continues to be interesting, but it's just fun to produce content and try to entertain people. Again, I always have the utmost respect for how you run this one and the thorough outline you give me because it makes it a lot easier. So if you don't listen to this pod and you're a Timberwolves fan, you should add this one to the weekly collection as well because it's really strong.
I appreciate all those kind words. They mean the world to me. So genuinely, thank you. And as you know by now, I will be pestering you again in the future. So thank you.
Absolutely. Let's do a little, when they make the finals, just have me on and we'll just drink and talk about the Wolves.